The jungle canopy of Veora 9 loomed overhead like a thick emerald ceiling, casting dappled shadows on the humid forest floor below. The air was dense with moisture and the constant hum of alien life. Vines as thick as arms curled around the trunks of massive blue-barked trees, and strange bird-like creatures flitted among the branches, emitting shrill metallic cries that echoed across the terrain. It was here, in this lush and unfamiliar biome, that the Galactic Coalition had dispatched one of its elite recon units to investigate reports of enemy movement near the equatorial belt. The team, composed entirely of technologically superior alien species, landed just after planetary dawn. Their ship, a sleek obsidian-gray insertion pod, hissed softly as the boarding ramp lowered into the undergrowth. 6 soldiers emerged, each clad in adaptive armor, scanning devices already affixed to their arms and visors. Among them was one human, the only human, a cadet named Private Mason Halbrook. He stepped off the ramp with a quiet sense of awareness, his boots sinking slightly into the moss-covered soil. He carried no scanning tech, only a utility belt, a collapsible machete, and a small notebook tucked into the side of his pack. Mason knew the drill. He wasn't here to lead, suggest, or innovate. He was a tag-along, an observer, as the Coalition politely called it. It was a role typically reserved for species still proving themselves on the intergalactic stage. Humans, despite their recent inclusion into the Galactic Coalition, were still viewed as primitive, clever perhaps, but unrefined, lacking the centuries of advanced culture and technology that defined the core civilizations. Commander Verk, a tall, scaled officer from the Oxari race, took point. His elongated skull shimmered slightly under the translucent field helmet, and his voice, when it broke through the comms, sounded like a mechanical growl. He barked orders in his native tongue, which were instantly translated through the squad's implants. Deploy Formation Delta. Scanners on full spectrum. Begin grid sweep of Sector 12. The squad immediately fell into position. Scanners began humming, projecting thin blue lines of energy into the jungle. Holographic overlays flickered to life over each soldier's visor. They walked with confidence, relying on their machines to alert them to movement, heat signatures, or power anomalies. Mason remained at the rear, his pace slower, eyes not fixed on a HUD but on the terrain itself. He had read every report on Veora 9 before the mission. All known flora, insect behavior, weather cycles, magnetic field fluctuations. It was something none of the others cared for. They trusted their equipment. Mason, however, trusted something older, instinct, experience, and the subtle patterns nature never failed to leave behind. The squad moved forward for nearly an hour, fanning out as they scanned low ridges and thickets. Each scan reported negative. No hostile presence, no artificial readings, no energy fluctuations. Commander Verk's patience thinned quickly. "Report!" he snapped over comms. "Nothing," came the reply from Lieutenant Serac, a feathered Sorelian with dual-eye optics. "No trace of combustion residue, EM interference, or radiation leakage. Maintain sweep. Widen frequency. If they are here, they're shielded." Mason crouched beside a thick-rooted tree, brushing a layer of damp leaves aside. Beneath them, he spotted the telltale imprints of 3-toed creatures, large enough to be predators but too aged to be fresh. What caught his attention more was the lack of insect movement around the area. Even on Earth, ants were nearly always present in warm, damp forests. He leaned closer. Sure enough, he spotted a line of small, iridescent ants trailing through the underbrush to his right, then sharply diverting around an open patch of ground to the left. He made a mental note but didn't speak up yet. Instead, he rose and followed the squad, who had now reached the edge of a steep decline. Below, a river wound its way through the jungle, its dark water barely visible through the dense foliage. The squad paused. Commander Verk tapped the side of his helmet. Thermals. Anything? Negative, answered Lieutenant Sarak. No movement either, added another soldier. Mason stepped forward cautiously. Sir, may I suggest? You may remain silent, Verk interrupted, not turning to face him. You are not here to offer primitive guesses. Mason said nothing more. He returned to the rear of the group, but his mind stayed sharp. The way those ants changed direction unnerved him. In every biome on Earth, ant colonies followed predictable foraging patterns, disrupted only by hostile presence or chemical interference. Something had disturbed their path, something unnatural. But it would be pointless to argue with the others. The aliens considered insects irrelevant, lesser life forms of no consequence. The squad continued for another half hour, frustration growing. Scanner feeds returned loops of interference. Heat mapping failed to distinguish between the planet's naturally warm vegetation and potential threats. A thin mist began to creep in from the river, obscuring visibility even further. Commander Verk growled low. The reports are false. This sector is abandoned. Mason wasn't so sure. He knelt once more just off the path and placed a small stone beside the ant trail. He watched as the creatures instinctively moved around it, always adjusting, always precise. He pulled out his notebook and sketched their path quickly, noting the angle of deviation and the direction they traveled. It wasn't just a detour, it was a curve, wide, consistent, and arcing toward a ridge roughly northeast of their current position. He stood brushing off his knees and took a deep breath. He didn't care about politics or status. If there was danger nearby, and he felt it in his gut, he wasn't going to wait for scanners to confirm it. Technology could fail. Nature rarely lied. As the squad regrouped at a clearing to reassess their path, Mason remained on the perimeter, eyes scanning the foliage. Not for enemies, but for insects, plant motion, subtle signs of something unnatural. He had learned in Earth's jungles, back during his survival training, that silence was as loud as sound. If birds stopped chirping, if ants broke formation, if animals gave a certain wide berth, it meant danger. Not always obvious, but always real. And here, on Vayora 9, the ants were screaming. He glanced one last time at the group, standing amid a flickering storm of glitching holograms, then turned his gaze back toward the ant trail. It was heading into terrain untouched by scans, too dense for drones, too quiet for sensors. Perfect cover. He tightened the straps on his pack. Tomorrow, when the sun returned, he would follow that trail, and he had a feeling it would lead straight to the enemy. By the time the mist began to lift from the forest floor, the squad had resumed movement, still locked into their grid pattern. The terrain grew more uneven as they pressed forward. Thick roots jutted out of the damp soil like skeletal hands, and odd growths pulsed faintly on the bark of the larger trees. The atmosphere was still saturated with moisture, clinging to everything and distorting sound. But Mason wasn't focused on the environment's discomfort. His attention was tuned to the subtle anomalies the rest of the team continued to ignore. The path the squad followed became less defined, more like a suggestion than a trail. Vines stretched across the way like waiting tripwires, and the canopy above grew tighter, blocking out much of the planetary light. Commander Verk pushed forward relentlessly, watching his wrist scanner pulse blue as it swept the jungle. But the scanner's results flickered. One moment displaying wide-open terrain, the next filled with static and heat bursts that faded as quickly as they appeared. "This interference is not natural," Verk growled into the comms. Lieutenant Sarak tapped his own scanner. "Possibly a residual energy field. Could be volcanic pockets underground." Verk bared his sharp teeth. "Vayora 9 has no known tectonic activity in this region." Mason walked in silence several meters behind the formation. He didn't trust the readings either. In fact, he didn't trust the scanners at all anymore. The jungle around him felt wrong. Not hostile exactly, but disturbed. Insects had vanished from the air. The distant animal calls that had once echoed through the trees were gone. Even the wind had grown still, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. He slowed his pace, crouching near a fallen log. He gently brushed aside a film of moss to inspect the soil beneath. The ants were still there, but in smaller numbers now. The trail that had once curved so clearly had become fragmented. The direction had changed slightly, arcing further east and narrowing. That confirmed it. Something was repelling them. Something they were programmed by nature to avoid. He didn't need a scanner to know that meant danger. Behind him, a static hiss cracked through the squad's shared comms channel. The sudden burst of noise startled the two soldiers flanking the formation, and both instinctively dropped to a defensive stance. Mason watched as Verk raised a clenched fist to halt the group. "Signal breach," the commander barked. "Scramble pattern, defensive posture." The team dispersed quickly into the undergrowth, activating personal cloaking fields that shimmered faintly before vanishing from view. Mason didn't have one. Humans hadn't yet been issued such tech in the coalition. He moved behind a thick fern, remaining still. He reached into his bag and pulled out a basic analog field compass. It jittered slightly, the needle uncertain. That told him more than any HUD overlay ever could. Sarek's voice buzzed through the comms. "Something's jamming us. Pulse intervals are irregular. No known coalition tech matches the interference pattern." Mason looked at the canopy. No visible drones. No lights. No sound above the forest's silence. It wasn't just jamming. It was active disruption, likely a field generator buried underground or camouflaged with local materials. He tapped the side of his ear where his comm link was embedded. "Sir," he said quietly, "if it's an artificial signal, we're close to something." Verk's reply came cold and sharp. "Do not offer tactical analysis, human. Resume silence." Mason bit the inside of his cheek and nodded to himself. He didn't need Verk's approval. He just needed the truth. He slid his notebook from his side pocket and marked the compass disturbance, then glanced down at the earth. The ants had completely disappeared from the immediate area. That wasn't natural, not unless something repelled them in waves. He knelt and touched the soil. Warm. Too warm. No sunlight had touched this ground for hours. Whatever was underneath them was producing heat in bursts. Up ahead, one of the alien soldiers shouted through the comms. "Echo return from ahead. Grid pattern mismatch." "Define," Verk ordered. "Scanner reads empty field, but LiDAR pulses return dense obstruction. Something's cloaked." Mason rose to his feet. He already knew what they were going to find, not a camp in plain view, but something hidden, something buried or sealed off from detection, maybe even deeper underground. But he also knew the others wouldn't listen until it was too late. He had to do what he always did. Keep observing, keep thinking, and stay ahead of the moment when chaos erupted. He watched the squad adjust formation, now cautiously encircling the area that had caused the anomaly. Sarek stepped forward with a small device resembling a spherical sensor probe and lobbed it forward. The ball landed softly in the moss and began emitting a low-frequency pulse. Blue light washed over the ground and trees, mapping the terrain in seconds. The team waited. But instead of data, the feed turned black. The projection died in silence. Seconds later, the probe cracked open like an egg, its inner core liquefied. Sarek cursed in his native tongue. Field disruption destroyed the core. It's being eaten, not shorted. Something is absorbing the signal. Mason took a few steps away from the group, back toward the edge of the trees. He didn't like the way the land dipped slightly here, almost like a shallow depression or crater, long overgrown. He looked again for the ants. Nothing. He scanned the tree trunks. The moss here grew in inconsistent patterns, almost as though something had scraped or disturbed them periodically. Suddenly, a faint tremor passed beneath his feet. Brief, soft, but unmistakable. Not a quake, a vibration, rhythmic, mechanical. Something beneath the ground had shifted. He turned his head toward the group. "Sir, I believe we're standing on top of something." Verk whirled toward him. "You will speak when spoken to." Mason pointed at the ground. "There's vibration underfoot. It's pulsing. Either a ventilation system or a motion platform. Whatever it is, it's artificial." Sarak stepped beside Verk. "He's not wrong. There's a pattern to the pulses. Every 6 seconds, then a brief rest. Could be a timed cycle." The commander glared at Mason but didn't respond. Instead, he activated a short-wave transmitter embedded in his gauntlet and sent a ping into the ground. The signal returned instantly, a distorted echo with a hard stop, like it had bounced off a metallic surface buried deep below. Verk narrowed his eyes. "Coordinates marked," he said. "This is no longer recon. We are now in breach territory." Mason's chest tightened. That meant fallback protocol was canceled. The squad would now proceed until direct contact or confrontation. But everything in his gut told him that would be a mistake. Whoever was hiding here, if it was indeed the enemy, had cloaked the area not just from scans, but from basic biology. The jungle life avoided it. The ants rerouted their entire colony. Even the trees seemed to grow around the spot rather than through it. Verk raised his plasma rifle and stepped toward the center of the glade. "Prepare to breach." Mason remained behind, staring at a single tree root that had curled up instead of down, pulled away from something buried. Nature had literally recoiled from the earth here. That wasn't something one ignored. That was something one respected. He turned east, quietly moving toward the ant trail again. He would map it himself, follow it, and prove what instinct already whispered. The scanners would never find the enemy, but the ants might. The forest narrowed around Mason as he stepped away from the glade, careful not to disturb the underbrush. The moment he crossed the threshold of the clearing, a subtle shift in atmosphere pressed against his skin. The air grew heavier, more stagnant, as if the trees were holding in a secret. The sounds of the squad behind him faded beneath the rustle of foliage, and he became acutely aware of his solitude. He did not announce his departure. He knew what the response would be if he did. He wasn't disobeying, not yet. He was observing, following something overlooked, something real. The ant trail reappeared beyond the uneven slope, faint but visible under the curled ferns. He crouched low, brushing aside damp leaves to trace the path with his fingertips. The insects were moving faster now, not in panic but with determined rhythm. Each one followed the curve precisely, veering around specific patches of dirt and fallen branches. He pulled out his notebook, marked the direction, and adjusted his route accordingly. The trail led northeast, toward the rising incline of the jungle's older growth. He advanced slowly, every step deliberate. There was no rush. His eyes scanned the ground for every ripple in the leaf litter, every movement that hinted at a story. The insects guided him as though trained, but this wasn't training. It was ancient, instinctive avoidance, a pattern older than technology. He moved past a low ridge and stopped when he noticed a section of mossy stones piled unnaturally. Not like a rock slide, but as though someone had shifted them to hide something. The ants avoided this pile entirely. He placed one hand against a nearby tree and leaned in to listen. His ear caught a low, periodic hum, muffled, like vibration passed through layers of earth. It matched the cycle he had counted earlier, 6 seconds on, 3 off, still consistent. He walked around the formation and continued following the ants as the terrain dipped again. The jungle thickened. Long vines hung down like curtains, brushing his shoulders as he moved. The air smelled different here, less of soil and more of metal, faint and metallic, as if the forest had grown over machinery and was beginning to reject it. The trees tilted at odd angles. Roots curled away from the center of the path he was following. It became clearer with each step that something was influencing the very structure of the biome. He crossed a narrow stream, stepping on slick rocks. The ants used a fallen branch as their bridge, and he followed without hesitation. Beyond the water, the foliage became denser. The canopy allowed only streaks of light to penetrate, and the ground turned spongy beneath his boots. As he reached a small rise, Mason froze. Ahead of him, the terrain shifted sharply. The ant trail encircled a wide area covered in dense, perfectly uniform grass, too uniform. He scanned the perimeter. No nests, no burrows, no insect movement of any kind. He pulled out a pocket thermal lens and lifted it toward the grass. The image revealed an unusual heat signature. Not hot, but unnaturally cold. The surrounding vegetation glowed with soft oranges and yellows, but the patch ahead remained pale blue, almost frozen. He knew no natural process on Viora 9 could explain that. Something was cloaking more than just its shape. It was dampening heat itself. That level of field manipulation required serious technology. He crouched low again, watching the ants. They had formed two trails along the outer edges, looping around the cold zone, but never crossing it. The loops met again on the far side and continued deeper into the jungle. Whatever this zone was, the ants understood it didn't belong. He retrieved a small probe from his pack, a human-made one, built for durability, not data transmission. He rolled it gently into the field. The probe slowed as it entered the strange zone. Its movements grew sluggish, like something was pressing against it. The temperature sensor on his wrist blinked, a sharp drop of 10 degrees Celsius in under 5 seconds. Mason frowned. That wasn't a simple camouflage net. That was environmental suppression. And it was active. He made a quick sketch of the field's perimeter and continued along the ant path, bypassing the cold zone as they did. The trail turned once more, and Mason passed between two enormous trees whose trunks had been hollowed at the base. As he moved through the natural archway, he found himself in a part of the jungle that looked almost untouched by wildlife. Not dead, just avoided. There were no droppings, no scratch marks on the trees, no fallen feathers or nests. Everything was unnaturally clean. Ahead, he saw something that made him stop mid-step, a ridge of broken roots emerging from the ground, curved and tightly woven like a dome. At first, it looked natural, a mass of roots twisted into a mound. But then he noticed the symmetry. Each arc of the root formation was the same distance apart. That was no accident. He approached slowly, circling the structure. The ants had diverged again, creating two flanking paths around the dome. Mason's breath slowed as he knelt and placed his palm gently against the structure. Warm. Not like the humid air. This warmth was artificial, regulated. He tapped once with the handle of his machete. The sound that returned was not the dull knock of wood, but a hollow metallic thud, masked beneath bark and growth. A shell, hidden underground, camouflaged with living roots. It wasn't abandoned. It was alive. Suddenly, he heard a rustle behind him. He turned sharply, crouching, hand on his sidearm, but it was only a flock of native birds scattering from a nearby canopy. He exhaled and lowered his hand, but the movement had triggered something else, a faint click beneath his feet. He glanced down. The soil shifted, then fell inward an inch. A pressure plate. He jumped back, just as a low-frequency pulse vibrated through the ground. The dome ahead shimmered faintly, and for a split second, its true surface became visible, smooth gunmetal black with reinforced edges and a slit-like opening hidden beneath the growth. Then it vanished again beneath the illusion. Mason stumbled backward, heart racing. He knew now that this was no forward operating post. This was a hidden outpost, cloaked with precision, positioned deep within the jungle for observation or ambush. He took out a piece of graphite chalk and marked the trees with a code he had learned in survival school. Symbols for concealed structure and heat suppression zone. He added a third mark, inhabited. Then he pulled his compass, aligned it with the marks on his map, and drew a triangle linking the ant trail, the cold field, and the hidden dome. The result painted a perfect perimeter around the area the alien squad had spent hours scanning without results. He tapped his comm link. Static answered him. The signal interference was stronger here. Deliberate. He sighed and shut it off. If he wanted to get the information back, he would have to return physically. He looked one last time at the dome and the still-moving ants, before turning to retrace his steps. His mind churned with possibilities. What kind of force used biological signals to mask movement? What species could manipulate nature so precisely? More importantly, how long had the Coalition's enemies been hiding here, undetected by the most advanced scanners in the galaxy? The answer was terrifying. Long enough. And unless someone listened, the next squad sent in might not come out. Mason picked up his pace. It was time to return and prove it. Mason descended the ridge with urgency pressed into every step. His boots barely made a sound as they moved over the soft jungle floor, but the pounding in his chest echoed louder than his footfalls. The sun had begun its slow crawl toward the western edge of the canopy, casting stretched shadows across the landscape and bathing the thick underbrush in amber light. With each stride, the air thickened again with moisture, and the symphony of distant insects began to rise. Faint at first, as though testing the safety of their return. The silence he had encountered near the concealed dome gradually gave way to the more familiar rhythms of the jungle. That, in itself, confirmed everything. Nature had built boundaries around something it instinctively feared. And now, as he pushed farther away from it, life dared to breathe again. He stopped only once to tear a strip from the edge of his notebook and lodge it into a split branch near the stream crossing. He marked it with a simple arrow and an H, a code he knew wouldn't be recognized by the alien squad, but one that meant human passage, critical direction. It was a habit born of being ignored, leaving signals for himself, or for the one chance someone might someday follow his path. He pressed on, retracing the arc of the ant trail in reverse, mentally replaying every contour of the terrain he had mapped on the way in. By the time he reached the perimeter of the squad's last known position, the shadows had grown longer, and the temperature had dropped. He moved cautiously, eyes sweeping ahead for signs of movement. Then he saw it, a faint shimmer of refracted light, low to the ground. The cloaking fields of the alien soldiers, still active, flickered subtly in the dim light. He slowed his pace and raised both hands as he stepped into view. "Private Mason," he said clearly, hoping one of them had remained on standard audio monitoring. "Returning with field data, visual confirmation of enemy installation." The shimmer to his right deactivated, revealing Lieutenant Serac. The Cerellian's head tilted as he stepped forward, sharp feathers slicked back with sweat, his dual-eye optics adjusting with a mechanical click. "You separated without clearance," Serac said without emotion. "I followed an environmental anomaly," Mason replied, lowering his hands. "I have a full triangulation on a cloaked structure. Confirmed thermal suppression and mechanical vibration consistent with life support systems. I logged echo responses and external artificial shielding." Serac's feathers ruffled slightly. "You expect Commander Verk to act on this?" "I expect him to not dismiss it," Mason said, keeping his voice measured. "But it's more than data. I've located a physical breach point." Another shimmer dissolved to Mason's left. Verk stepped forward slowly, arms crossed over his chest plate, his piercing yellow eyes locked onto Mason with clear disdain. "You abandoned formation," Verk said coldly. "You ignored chain of command. You interfered with coalition protocol." "I identified what your scanners couldn't," Mason replied. "You're searching for an enemy too advanced for your technology to track. I followed behavior, biological displacement, ant trails, insect avoidance patterns, route distortion, ground temperature anomalies." Verk scoffed. "You followed bugs?" I followed everything your sensors filtered out as irrelevant, but nature doesn't lie. Serac stepped forward, opening his wrist console. You mentioned echo pings. What are the coordinates? Mason produced his notebook, flipping to the most recent page. 3 distinct landmarks. I marked trees near the breach zone, and I can walk you in within 15 minutes, but we go quiet. No scanners. You activate those, and we might trigger a response. Verk snatched the notebook and stared at the human script. His eyes narrowed. If this is a trick, you'd already be dead, Mason said quietly. That structure is occupied. I triggered a pressure plate. I saw the outer shell. It's masked, but it's there. This isn't an abandoned recon pod. This is an active outpost, and it's watching us. The tension stretched tight between them. For a moment, it seemed Verk would toss the notebook aside and order his men back into scanning formation. But then Serac turned his console toward him and said something in a low voice. Verk's eyes narrowed. He said nothing, but after a breath he closed the notebook and gave Mason a hard nod. Lead. Mason turned without hesitation and moved into the jungle again, this time with silent footfalls behind him. The squad followed in a single-file formation, suppressing their cloaks and disengaging all scanners. The only tools they allowed active were passive observation lenses and thermals turned to minimal sensitivity. As they advanced, the jungle began to grow quiet again, and the signs returned. The fading of insect song, the hesitation of birds. Serac noticed it too. This pattern, Serac murmured. The silence follows geometry. It's deliberate, Mason said. The structure is engineered into the living ecosystem. It's not just hidden from us. It's hidden from nature. They reached the stream crossing. Mason pointed to the fallen branch the ants had used. He didn't mention the notebook marker. There was no need. The trail ahead would speak for itself. He led them past the water, around the dead zone, and back to the ring of root-draped trees. He stopped and gestured toward the dome's position. We're within 15 meters. The cold zone begins at 6. Vibration cycles are active. There's a pressure plate directly ahead of that protruding root. Serac raised a lens and nodded slowly. Confirmed. Thermal suppression begins there. Cold enough to be unnatural. Verk motioned silently to 2 soldiers who flanked the dome's perimeter, moving like shadows. One of them stopped and signaled. Contact. She had spotted something. Mason moved up behind her and crouched. A fine hairline crack in the moss was visible, shaped like an entry seam. It matched the slit he had glimpsed during the Shimmer event. A disguised hatch. Any reading? Verk asked. None, Serac replied. We're too close for effective radar. If it's shielded internally, we won't know what's inside until we're through. Then we go in, Verk said. No, Mason said firmly. That plate I triggered, it was a signal, not a trap. Whoever's inside knows this perimeter was touched. If you breach, we lose the advantage. Then what do you suggest, human? Mason looked at the mossy dome and the unnatural stillness surrounding it. We watch. Wait for the next signal. We don't move until something moves first. Verk hesitated. Serac looked to him, then back at the dome. The decision was made in silence. The squad settled into a temporary observation ring, camouflaged by the jungle itself. No technology, no scans, only line of sight and environmental awareness. Mason took a position just above the slope and kept his eyes trained on the false clearing. As the sun dipped fully behind the trees and shadows stretched long into the clearing, a thin panel on the dome shifted open. A figure emerged, lean, tall, wrapped in muted armor with a helmet shaped like an elongated crescent. He moved silently to the cold zone's edge and crouched. His hand touched the soil where Mason's boot had landed. Then he froze. The figure looked up, not directly at Mason, but in his direction, and nodded. Then he vanished into the dome again. Mason's blood ran cold. He turned slowly to Verk. They knew I was there. They let me go. On purpose. Verk's jaw tightened. Then the real question is, why? Silence engulfed the perimeter as the last flicker of light faded behind the ridge. The jungle for a moment felt suspended in time, breathless, listening. Mason remained still, crouched in the cover of twisted roots, his eyes locked on the place where the figure had appeared. No one moved. Even Commander Verk, usually restless and impatient, stood motionless, his sharp jaw clenched tight, his attention fixed on the dome's hidden hatch. Mason's pulse had slowed, but a strange tightness remained in his chest. The brief glance exchanged with the armored figure played over in his mind. That was no routine patrol. That was deliberate contact, calculated, almost ritualistic in its precision. Whoever that soldier was, he had known Mason was human, and he had chosen to reveal himself, then retreat. Mason felt it wasn't a mistake. It was a message. Serac tapped his wrist quietly, initiating a silent data sync with the rest of the squad. The thermal lens picked up nothing further. No sound, no motion. Just the faint, constant pulse of the dome's internal systems, barely detectable but still present. Commander Verk took a slow breath and finally turned to Mason. "What did you see?" Mason answered without hesitation. "A reconnaissance operative. Solo patrol. Watched me. Made no hostile move. He examined the spot where I stepped and looked directly toward my last known position." "Did he see you?" "Yes." "Why didn't he engage?" "I think he was confirming something." "Explain." Mason hesitated, choosing his words. "I believe he knew I came alone. I think he was observing how I found the dome. Not scanning tech. Behavior. He wanted to see how a human could reach something your entire squad missed." Verk's eyes narrowed. "You think this was a test?" "I think it was a warning," Mason replied. "But not a threat. An invitation." Verk straightened. "You're suggesting the enemy is playing games?" "No," Mason said. "I think they were waiting. And now that I've seen them, we're running out of time." Serac stepped forward, adjusting his optics. "If they know we're watching, our window is closing. We need to decide, breach, retreat, or initiate contact." Verk looked at the camouflaged dome again, lips pressed tight. "We weren't sent to negotiate. But we also weren't sent to fail," Mason added. "If we breach now, without knowing the numbers inside or their tech level, we risk annihilation. But if we do nothing, they'll relocate by nightfall. That figure, he wasn't guarding a structure, he was guarding information. And he was gauging our response." Verk exhaled slowly. "Then what would you do, human?" "I'd go back in," Mason said. "Alone." The squad stiffened. Serac's feathers rippled. "That would be suicide. Not if I approached the same way I did before. Unarmed, slow, intentional. I already made contact once. He didn't kill me. He studied me. If I go back, he might open that hatch again." Verk stepped toward Mason, towering over him. "You are a cadet. Not a diplomat, not a soldier of rank." "I'm the only one he acknowledged," Mason said. "You can watch from the ridge. If anything happens, you'll have position. But if we do nothing, we learn nothing. The Council will send another squad in a week. Or worse, a drone strike. That dome and everything inside will be incinerated." Verk stared at him for a long time. Mason didn't look away. He saw the conflict play across the commander's reptilian features, discipline clashing with instinct. Then Verk took a step back and spoke low. "You have 10 minutes." Mason nodded, stripped his weapons, and secured his gear behind a fallen log. He took only his notebook and a strip of cloth, tying it visibly around his upper arm, a signal flag in white. Then he stood, raised both hands, and walked forward. The jungle made no sound. Every leaf, every vine, every root seemed to watch as he crossed the cold zone again. The temperature dropped as he stepped into it, but this time, he didn't flinch. The soil felt slightly softer beneath his boots, recently disturbed. He passed the same root formation, now even more unnatural in its symmetry, and stopped just outside the area where the pressure plate had triggered. He waited. 10 seconds passed. 20. Then he heard it. The same faint hiss. A seam opened in the moss ahead. The dome's hatch split along the vertical, exposing a narrow corridor of dark steel glowing faintly with blue veins of energy. The same figure stepped forward, helmet still in place, body posture unreadable. The figure stood in the doorway, silent. Mason raised one hand and pointed at his own chest. "Human," he said clearly. "No weapons, no threat." The figure didn't speak. Instead, he reached up and removed his helmet. What Mason saw stunned him. The soldier's face was humanoid, not entirely, but unmistakably close. Gray-blue skin, slightly elongated eyes with horizontal pupils, a ridged line across the cheekbones like armor plate grown beneath the skin. He looked young, barely older than Mason, but his eyes carried weight, centuries of memory compressed into silence. The figure raised his own hand and tapped his chest. "Kaylor," he said, voice calm, neutral. Mason blinked. "You speak?" Kaylor nodded once. "Why did you let me go?" Mason asked. "You listened to the ground," Kaylor said, "so I listened to you." Mason tried to hide his shock. "Are you the only one here?" Kaylor did not answer. "Is this your camp?" Still no reply. Mason took a slow breath. "I think your presence here is a message. But if you don't say anything, the others behind me will call this a threat." Kaylor tilted his head. "Then tell them what you saw." Mason's voice lowered. "They don't trust me." Kaylor stepped forward, stopping only 2 meters away. "You're not here to be trusted. You're here to see." Mason nodded slowly, understanding more than he could explain. "Will I see more if I go in?" Kaylor's expression did not change, but his eyes shifted slightly, a subtle flicker of approval. But you've seen enough." The hatch began to close. Kaylor stepped back into the dome without another word. The seam sealed shut, vanishing once more under layers of moss and silence. Mason stood alone. He returned slowly, retracing every step with deliberate care. When he reached the squad's observation line, Verk stepped out first. "Well?" the commander asked. Mason kept his voice steady. "I spoke with one. His name is Kaylor. He speaks our language. He let me go again." "Did he confirm anything?" "No specifics. But he said I was here to see, and I have." Verk's eyes burned into him. "And what did you see, human?" Mason looked past him toward the jungle, toward the dome, now hidden once more. "I saw intelligence, restraint, purpose, and I saw that we were never meant to find them through technology." Sarak stepped forward. "Then what do you propose we tell command?" Mason took a long breath. "That this isn't a war zone, not yet. But if we treat it like one, we'll lose more than just men. We'll lose a chance to understand something older and wiser than all our scanners combined." Verk said nothing, but he didn't argue. The squad began to gather their gear, and the cloaking fields shimmered back into place. Mason stood for a moment longer before reaching into his notebook and writing a single sentence on a fresh page. "Nature remembers what technology forgets." Then he closed the book and followed the squad into the jungle, the trail behind him all